A history of Africa is too often told through the narrow lens of colonization, a narrative that begins in subjugation and ends in a fractured struggle for independence. But peel back the layers of recent centuries, and a different reality emerges. A tapestry woven with empires that rivaled Rome, military minds that stunned the ancient world, and leaders whose grasp of statecraft and strategy offers enduring lessons for the modern era. To understand the true scope of African leadership, we must first dismantle the myth of a dark continent devoid of complex political structures. We have to look far back to the sun-drenched coasts of North Africa, where the ancient powers of Egypt and Carthage defined early civilization. It is here that we encounter one of history's supreme tacticians, Hannibal Barca. While Carthage is often remembered merely as Rome's antagonist, Hannibal represents the epitome of asymmetric warfare and strategic audacity. Facing the overwhelming industrial and manpower advantage of the Roman Republic, Hannibal understood that a direct collision would lead to defeat. The lesson he offers is the power of the unexpected. His legendary crossing of the Alps in 218 BC, taking elephants and an army over frozen, treacherous passes deemed impassable by his enemies, was more than a logistical miracle. It was a psychological masterstroke that struck terror into the heart of Rome. Hannibal taught the world that rigid adherence to conventional warfare is a liability when facing a superior force. His famous double envelopment at the Battle of Cannae remains a staple in military academies today, a perfect demonstration of using an opponent's aggression against them, drawing them into a calculated kill zone. Yet, Hannibal's story also carries a tragic lesson in the limits of military genius unbalanced by political support. While he won battles on the Italian peninsula for 15 years, the oligarchs back in Carthage, fearing his rising power and weary of the cost, failed to send the necessary reinforcements to secure total victory. It is a stark reminder that even the most brilliant field commander cannot succeed indefinitely if the political apparatus at home is fractured or lacking in resolve. The Carthaginian failure to capitalize on Hannibal's brilliance underlines the necessity of unified national strategy. As the influence of Carthage waned and Rome rose, the center of gravity shifted southward, across the Great Sahara, where new forms of power were emerging, less reliant on constant warfare, and built instead on the sophisticated management of unimaginable resources. Crossing the formidable barrier of the Sahara, we leave the Mediterranean sphere and enter the golden age of West African empires. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, the Sahel region gave rise to states of immense complexity, dominated by the empires of Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai. The leadership lessons here shift from the purely tactical to the grand strategic, specifically the wielding of economic power as a tool of diplomacy and influence. No figure embodies this more profoundly than Mansa Musa of Mali. Often cited as the wealthiest individual in human history, Musa's reign in the 14th century demonstrated that true power lay not just in the sword, but in the stability of administration and the control of trade. The lesson of Mansa Musa is the importance of projecting power through stability and culture, rather than mere brute force. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was not just a religious journey, it was a calculated diplomatic mission designed to place Mali on the global map. By distributing so much gold in Cairo that he single-handedly crashed the local economy for a decade, he demonstrated an unprecedented scale of economic might that commanded respect from Europe to the Middle East. However, Musa's greatness wasn't just in spending, it was an investment. He understood that sustainable power requires intellectual infrastructure. He poured vast resources into Timbuktu, transforming it into a premier center of Islamic scholarship, attracting mathematicians, astronomers, and jurists from across the known world. The Sankore Madrasa became a beacon of knowledge, proving that the most enduring legacy a leader can leave is an educated populace and cultural institutions that outlive their reign. The West African Golden Age teaches us that economic prosperity, when coupled with a commitment to intellectual advancement, creates a society resilient enough to dominate its region without constant warfare. Yet this golden age was not destined to last forever. As global trade routes shifted towards the Atlantic coast and European powers began their aggressive expansion, the nature of African leadership was forced to change again, shifting from the management of gold and knowledge to a desperate, innovative fight for survival against a technologically advanced and morally bankrupt invading force. As the dark shadow of the transatlantic slave trade lengthened across the continent in the 16th and 17th centuries, the requirements for leadership underwent a violent transformation. The luxury of long-term cultural investment was replaced by the urgent need for defensive adaptation. The lesson from this era is one of diplomatic agility and the refusal to accept a predetermined fate in the face of overwhelming odds. This is best exemplified by Queen Nzinga Ana de Sousa Mbande of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in modern-day Angola. Nzinga confronted the Portuguese Empire at the height of its aggressive expansion, a time when European powers were accustomed to dictating terms to indigenous leaders. Nzinga's brilliance lay in her ability to operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. She was a warrior queen who led her troops into battle well into her 60s, evolving her military tactics to counter Portuguese firearms by adopting guerrilla warfare styles, utilizing the difficult terrain to ambush and disrupt supply lines. But it was in the diplomatic arena where her genius truly shone, understanding that she could not completely defeat the Portuguese militarily. She mastered the art of playing European powers against one another. She formed strategic alliances with the Dutch to weaken the Portuguese grip on the coast, turning European rivalries into an African defensive advantage. The famous story of her first meeting with the Portuguese governor, where upon being offered no chair, she sat upon the back of one of her servants to speak with him eye to eye, is a powerful metaphor for her entire reign, an absolute refusal to be treated as an inferior. The lesson Nzinga offers is that when faced with an existential threat, rigid principles must sometimes give way to pragmatic alliances. She adopted Christianity as a diplomatic tool when it suited her needs and discarded it when it didn't. Her leadership was defined by fluid resistance, proving that even when outgunned, a smaller power can maintain its sovereignty through supreme political acumen and the will to endure. While Nzinga fought a defensive war in Central Africa, further south, as the pressures of European encroachment and internal population shifts intensified, a different kind of leader was forging a new reality, one built not on defense, but on hyper-aggression and military revolution. In the early 19th century, the region of southern Africa underwent a period of profound upheaval and transformation, known as the Mfecane, or the crushing. Out of this chaos emerged the Zulu kingdom, forged by the indomitable will of Shaka Kasenzanga Kona. Shaka's lessons are perhaps the most controversial, as they demonstrate the terrifying effectiveness of absolute discipline and military innovation, coupled with the dark costs of tyrannical rule. Before Shaka, warfare among the Nguni peoples was often highly ritualized, involving throwing spears and relatively low casualties. Shaka recognized that this old way was insufficient for the consolidation of power needed in a changing landscape. His genius was in systemic military reform. He introduced the Iklua, a short stabbing spear, that forced his warriors into close-quarters combat, eliminating the option of fighting from a safe distance. He discarded sandals, hardening his troops' feet so they could march 50 miles a day and still fight, giving the Zulu army unprecedented mobility. Most famously, he developed the buffalo horns formation, a tactical maneuver involving a strong center to pin the enemy, while swift flanking horns encircled and annihilated them. The lesson here is that groundbreaking success often requires a complete tearing down of established norms and a ruthless commitment to efficiency. Shaka built a meritocracy where advancement was based on battlefield performance rather than lineage, creating an intensely loyal and motivated fighting force that absorbed dozens of smaller clans into a unified Zulu identity. However, Shaka's story serves as a potent warning about the corrosive nature of unchecked power. His leadership, effective in war, became paranoid and destructive in peace. Following the death of his mother, his grief manifested in draconian decrees that led to the execution of thousands of his own people, ultimately leading to his assassination by his half-brothers. Shaka taught the world how to build an empire through military precision, but his downfall reminds us that a system built entirely on fear and violence is inherently unstable, eventually consuming its own creator. A legacy of such warrior states would eventually clash with full-scale European colonization, leading to a century of subjugation that would only be broken by a new generation of leaders in the 20th century. Men who swapped the spear for the podium, fighting a war of ideas. The 20th century demanded a fundamental shift in the weaponry of African leadership. The battlefields were no longer physical terrains of savanna or forest, but the global stages of the United Nations, the debating halls of universities, and the hearts and minds of an oppressed populace. The fight against colonialism required visionary leaders who could articulate a future that did not yet exist, mobilizing masses not through conscription, but through consciousness. The lessons from this era are rooted in the power of Pan-African unity, moral fortitude, and self-reliance. We see this in Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the pioneer who understood that political independence was meaningless without economic liberation. His famous dictum, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all else shall be added unto you," was a rallying cry. But his deeper lesson was that a divided Africa would always be vulnerable to neo-colonial exploitation. His vision of a United States of Africa remains an unrealized blueprint for continental strength. We see a different facet of this leadership in Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. Sankara's brief, blazing rule taught the lesson of radical self-sufficiency and integrity. He rejected foreign aid, famously stating, "He who feeds you controls you." By slashing government salaries, refusing luxurious perks for officials, and mobilizing his people for massive infrastructure and reforestation projects, he demonstrated what could be achieved when leadership is entirely devoted to the service of the common citizen, untainted by corruption. And finally, there is the enduring lesson of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. Facing the monolithic brutality of apartheid, Mandela's greatest strategic victory was not on the battlefield, but in his refusal to allow his spirit to be broken during 27 years of incarceration. His leadership teaches the supreme power of reconciliation over retribution. By choosing to build a rainbow nation rather than seeking vengeance against his oppressors, he avoided a racial civil war and provided a moral template for the world. From Hannibal's tactics to Mandela's restraint, the history of African leadership is not a footnote. It is a masterclass in strategy, resilience, and the relentless human drive for self-determination. These are lessons born of blood and gold, of tragedy and triumph, that remain vitally relevant to the challenges of the 21st century.